Welcome to Yoga with Miss Erin. Today I'm going to be talking about yoga alignment, and I'll get into what that means in just a second. Really, this video is geared more towards adults. Alignment is not the most important in children. Unless it really looks like they're about to hurt themselves, I wouldn't correct their alignment because yoga is really for kids, just about feeling that movement in your body and establishing a connection between your body and your mind. So in adults, however, alignment is important for two reasons. Number one, alignment makes sure you get the most out of every yoga pose. And number two, alignment makes sure you don't hurt yourself in any yoga pose. Alignment is not the end all be all. You're not gonna, be the worst yoga person ever if you're not great at alignment, but I will be offering modifications to kind of help you feel that a little bit better. And especially if you have tight hamstrings, bad low back problems, shoulder problems, alignment's going to be really important for you to make sure that you're not hurting yourself during your yoga practice. An example of how our alignment can get off sometimes, maybe you hurt your hip, so you've been walking really hard on your left. Then that might start to hurt your other hip. You might notice some knee problems, you might notice that you're feeling a little tighter in this area. So yoga will kind of help you be a little bit more aware of that alignment, both emotionally and physically, because you carry around a lot of emotions in your body as well. So number one, your feet are always going to be hip width distance apart unless it's a specific pose where they're very obviously not hip width distance apart. Hip width distance apart means where your hip bones are, not where the edges of your hips are. So wherever your hip bones are, you want to make sure your ankles are in line with that, and so are your toes. You also want your toes and your knees to always be pointing the same direction. So let's say I'm in a warrior pose. I want to have my toes and my knees both facing forward. You don't want to have your toes going like this and your knee going like that or anything, because that could hurt both the outside, the inside of your leg, or anything in your knee, and it can even hurt your back because a lot of what's in your knee goes up into your hip and into your low back. So this can cause a lot of issues if you are not being very aware of where your knee is pointing. Another thing you want to be aware of in a pose like this is that your knees aren't going over your toes. You want to make sure your knees and your ankles are pretty much aligned. If you feel like you need to go a little farther for a stretch, you want to pull your leg backwards a little bit more rather than dumping forwards. Another thing to note here is your hips. I'm being kind of bad right now. I'm dumping into this side of my hips. So what you want to do is really make sure that your hips are as square as they can be, in line with each other. So you'd want to be able to take a ruler and go straight across your hips. Another thing you want to keep in mind with your feet is the way that your toes and the bottoms of your feet are really engaging with the mat. So grounding is very important here. Your toes, big toe, pinky toe, and your heels, the inner heel and the outer heel are going to be your 4 points. So when you hear a yoga teacher say, feel all 4 corners of your feet, that's what they mean. They want you to be placing your weight evenly across those 4 points. You lift your toes up and gradually put them back down on the mat. You kind of want to feel like you're grabbing the mat a little bit so that you're really making sure that you're not dumping into your toes or your heels and really putting yourself off balance. You also want to make sure you're not dumping into your arches or really standing on the outside of your feet too much. So making sure that all of those 4 corners feel nice and grounded is very important. You almost want to feel like you're pushing against the ground. Now we'll move up our legs to our knees. Knees are very important in a lot of different yoga poses. Like I was saying, you want to make sure your knees and your toes are pointed in the same direction and your knee does not go over your ankle as much as possible. Another thing you want to make sure with your knees is that you kind of always engage them. They always have a slight bend in them so that you're not locking your knees ever. So I'll give you an example of this in a forward bend. I have pretty tight hamstrings, so I can't just bend over and touch my toes. If I were to hyperextend my legs, I would bend over and that sends my hips backwards. It's locking my legs. I'm not getting the stretch that I need from this, and alignment is really not where it should be. So what you want to do is create that micro bend in your knees. Bend forward. It allows you to come forward at the hips, and this really pulls that hamstring muscle up and does not put excess pressure on your knees, which again will not hurt your hamstrings or your hips or your back. So bending forward, and feel free to keep that bend as deep as you need it. touching your chest to your knees and pushing back up. Same thing goes with a halfway lift. So straightening everything in a halfway lift. A lot of times people want to lock and they're straightening up. Feels like a nice stretch, but what you're feeling is not a nice stretch really, that's a strain. So what you want to do is create that micro bend in your knees and straighten from the hips. This is also a great place to keep in mind where your weight is in your feet, because your weight can go backwards and you lose a little balance, or your weight can go forwards and you lose a little balance. But you want to make sure that your weight in your feet, all four corners, got that micro bend in your knees, and you're able to really feel that stretch. Aside from that, your legs are very important for a number of reasons. You don't want your legs to just be there. You want your legs to be that micro bend, and that micro bend really might be enough for the engagement for you. Just creating that little oomph that engages your quads, it engages your hamstrings, and it engages part of your calves. So that's all going to make sure that your legs are a part of your practice. You can even imagine that you're hugging your legs in a little bit. Because what happens when you lock your knees, or when you're just letting your legs be there, say you're in a tree pose. Now I'm going to be adjusting all my balance up here. But if you create that micro bend in your knees, you really engage those legs, and now my tree pose, all of my balance is going to be coming from my legs. I'm not going to be doing any of this craziness. You're going to be just engaging your legs and making sure that those are what's keeping you steady and stable. Now we move on to our hips. I mentioned the squaring your hips earlier. Very important, because your hips are really key to a lot of different emotions. Your hips and your emotions are very tightly interconnected. That's why dancing can feel so good, and that's why yoga can feel so good. And sometimes you harbor a lot of negative emotions here, and tight hips can make those emotions feel worse. And injured hips can make those even worse. So we want to make sure we're very careful for our sweet little hips. So hips being squared, it's not one or the other going backwards. And we also want to make sure that this tilt in our pelvis is accurate. So give you a little side view here. For example, in mountain pose, we're standing, and you want to envision that your pelvis is like a bowl. You don't want to be sticking it out and spilling your contents forward. You don't want to tuck it too much and spill your contents backwards. But you want to just stand and slightly engage this lower abdominal section, and that will bring your tailbone in a little bit rather than tucking it all the way under. Think of it as lengthening down. You're lengthening your tailbone down, and you're holding your hips steady right here in a nice square, and one is not up or down from the other. Really important in poses where your hips are not even. You don't want to dump into either hip. You don't want to be doing something like this. You want to make sure your hips are together and they're in the same straight line. It's always important for every pose that you're going to be putting your hips in, unless it's a specific pose that is creating some type of rotation in your hips. This is very, very important stuff that I would recommend doing in your everyday life. So say you're doing dishes, maybe notice what those four corners of your feet are doing, or if you're leaning really far in to turn the faucet on and you're sending one of your hips back. So your back and your chest are what I'm going to talk about next. And maybe a little bit of abs too, but that kind of gets into some of my lower positions. We'll go into abs a little bit more later. But your back and your chest, you want to make sure that you're engaging them. So this right here, we do a lot of slouching in our everyday life. We don't want to overcompensate, stick our chests up super high. But what we want to do is maybe engage that lower part of your abs. Kind of feel like this part of your abs is hugging in. So you want to hug your ribs, lower ribs in, and you want to pull your shoulder blades away from your ears and back down. So we're not doing any of this, not doing any of this, we're doing this. So you can kind of roll your shoulders down your spine, but again, you want to feel that squareness. And it's a good rule of thumb, the back of your shoulders should be level with your pelvis. So not too much pulling forward. We want to correct that by pulling our ribs down and rolling our shoulders back. The last thing we need to pay attention to here is our neck. So in a position like this, you don't want to be just gazing wherever. You want to make sure that your gaze is purposeful. You're looking somewhere so that you're not looking up and doing all these weird things with your neck. So you want to find somewhere in line with wherever your position is. A lot of times in a position where you're looking up, a yoga teacher will say, look past your thumbs, so that your gaze is staying in line with where it needs to be, because we don't ever want to extend the neck too far or bend the neck back too much. A good example of this, in a seated fold, you might want to gaze at your toes rather than forward, because that creates that bend in the neck that we don't want. Again, this is not the end all be all, so if you find yourself looking up, that's not going to kill you, your neck's not going to fall off. Just try to readjust that as often as you can. So now we'll talk about abs. In something like a chaturanga, abs are very important, or even just a plank. You don't want to be dumping, you want to be lifting from your abs, so that your abs are pulling your body up, and it's not just your arms. The abs are very important in so many poses that you may not even think they're important. If you're in a pose where you're lifting your legs up off the ground, and you notice that you have a cute little loaf right here. That loaf means you're not engaging those lower muscles the way that you need to. So what you want to do is kind of embody that hugging feeling, and you want to embody that pelvis feeling instead of just lifting and letting your abs do everything. That puts a lot of pressure on your low back. So you want to purposefully pull those back muscles in. And I still have a little bit of a loaf, but it's not as pronounced. Another thing to note, in your alignment, sitting down in an L sit can be very difficult if you do not have stretched hamstrings. I do not have stretchy hamstrings, which is why in my L sit, a lot of times I opt to put my hands behind me to kind of relieve some of that pressure and make sure that I'm not slouching. This slouch doesn't give you the stretch that you need in your back, can actually do a little bit of damage. You can also bend your knees a little bit, or stick a block or a pillow or something underneath you to elevate your sit bones a little bit and make this slightly easier. You never want to round your spine, trying to reach your toes. You always want to bend from your hips and make sure that if you need to compensate for anything, that compensation is not happening here, it's happening here. Always. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate some of these alignment tips in some very common yoga poses by going through a sun salutation A, Suryanamaskara A. We're going to start at the top of our mats. We're going to make sure that our knees are pointing the same way as our toes. We have a micro bend in those knees, and I'm feeling all four corners of my feet pushing into the ground. Making sure that my hips are squared and that my abs are engaged so my pelvis is not tipping one way or the other. I'm going to make sure that I'm hugging my rib cage in while also lifting my shoulders and rotating them down my spine. And I'm going to make sure that from here I can take a nice deep breath comfortably. Nothing feels out of whack. Awesome. So we'll start by lifting our arms up to the ceiling, and we'll also lift our gaze in that same breath. And you can look up a little bit here, but don't go too far back. Another thing here is we ideally want our arms to be next to our ears. It's okay if your arms are a little bit forward, but really we want those arms to be as up by our ears as we can. However, we don't want the shoulders to be by our ears. We want our shoulders to stay down. This trap muscle needs to stay rotated away from our ears. So making sure that my shoulders are pulled away from my ears, I will take my gaze up and gradually bring my arms back down to my sides. From here, we're going to go into our first forward bend. In general, a number one forward bend, you want to bend your knees no matter what. I'm going to bend my knees because I have like a little bit tighter hamstrings, and it's our first one, but we always want to keep that micro bend no matter what. So from here, bending from our hips, we want to bend forward into this fold. I find that it's easy to touch all of my muscles. Touching those muscles kind of helps you engage them. We want to bring our chest towards our knees, and I like to hold on to the back of my legs here. That kind of helps me not dump my shoulders into my ears. So this kind of keeps my shoulders where I need them to be, away from my ears. You could also send your arms behind you, making sure that you're hugging your wrists together if you want to open your heart. Now we'll take our hands down to the ground, and I'm going to hop back into chaturanga, but you could easily step back into a chaturanga. If you are going to hop, however, make sure that you hop with your hips up and then back. So I'll kind of show you what that looks like now. So it's like a little bit of a float there. Now we'll go into chaturanga. This is that pose that I'm telling you about, kind of is very injurious. So we don't want to start back here. We don't want to be too far forward. We want to have our hips, our hands, our wrists underneath our shoulders, and we want to be feeling the same thing with our feet. We want to be feeling all four corners of our hands. Again, if this is too hard for you, please feel free to come down to your knees. But in this plank position, we want to feel all of our hands, kind of feel like you're suction cupping the mat a little bit with one of your hands. We want to hug our upper arms in, and we want to bend with a right angle near our chest, like that. We don't want to sink down with our hips first. We want to make sure everything stays in line until we come down to the bottom here, and you can lay down and unroll your feet for our up dog or cobra. Another option in chaturanga is to come down, if you have the strength, it's a little difficult, to about where your hips would be, unroll and lift your chest up. So we want to avoid diving down and scooping up. That's not what we're looking for from this pose. We want to dive down, unroll, and lift. Here we're engaging our quads, lifting away in the up dog, and we don't want to hyperextend. We want to keep that micro bend in our arms while we're gazing forward. Not gazing up, gazing forward. If you opt for cobra here, you can take your hands either next to your chest, next to your shoulders, next to your ears, wherever it feels most comfortable. And you're going to bend upwards. Do not extend here. We want to keep our hands hugged in and bending. Again, feeling all four corners of those hands for this back bend. From here, either in your up dog, we're going to untuck and send the hips back, or in your cobra, we're going to untuck and lift our hips high. You kind of want to make sure your alignment for down dog, if you were to be in a tabletop, it's just a little bit farther. So instead of knees under hips, hands under shoulders, we want to be just a little bit in front of our shoulders and a little bit behind our hips, and then we'll send those hips up into the sky. You may notice I have a bend in my knees here. I am not flexible enough to straighten my legs out, and you don't want to do this. This is not what we want. Here we want our heels to be as close to the ground as we can get them, and you can bend your knees as much as you need to make that happen. We want to make sure we're pushing our hips to the sky and kind of lifting from our hips so that we're not just pushing into our shoulders here. If you want to gaze up at your belly button, it's a little much. I prefer to gaze down directly at the mat and make sure that my shoulders are not dumping in towards my ears. Might be kind of hard to see with my shirt, but I am pulling my shoulders away from my ears while also pulling my arms in towards each other. From here, we can either do another hop, where we bend our knees very generously and hop forward, or you can walk your hands forward. From here, we'll do another halfway lift and another forward fold, and rising all the way up, bringing our hands to heart center. Okay, that concludes our yoga alignment tips for the day. So I think I've pretty much covered all of the basics and a lot of ways that you can modify things if you are not the stretchiest human being alive. Huge modification tips: always bend your knees, never compensate somewhere else. always want to compensate in bending your knees, and always, always, always feel like you can take a modification. So like I said in chaturanga, if this is feeling like a lot for you, going to your knees makes it so much easier, and it's really easy to practice that alignment in this. Here you can practice without feeling like you need to keep the rest of yourself up. So if you're having trouble with that alignment, that dip that I was talking about here, you can practice avoiding that dip with your knees down. Also, in a pose like a tree, if you feel like no matter what you're doing, you're still not getting that balance, a good way to help you find that balance is simply letting your foot sit on the ground. Or, like I said, in a warrior pose, if you feel like you need to bend a little bit more, just take this leg back farther. Do not bend your leg over your toes. So that pretty much concludes it for my alignment modification tips. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And I hope this video helps you with your everyday alignment, your alignment in your yoga practice, and teaching yoga to children. Don't hurt yourself, have a good time, and thanks for doing yoga with me.